If you've ever lived in a household with children, you'll know something about the challenges of getting people to eat things they don't really want to. In our house, that tends to be fruit and vegetables. Now, the book of Leviticus, which we're about to start in reading the Bible in a year, has a lot to say about what people should and should not eat. And the Christian writer Origen, one of the earliest Christian commentators on the book of Leviticus, had this to say: "If you read people passages from the divine books that are good and clear, they will hear them with great joy. But provide someone with a reading from Leviticus, and at once the listener will gag and push it away as if it were some bizarre food." The truth is that lots of people, in fact probably the majority of people, find Leviticus a very difficult book to read, and they clearly have done for thousands of years. And when I hear people say that they'll read the Bible in a year, especially from cover to cover, my usual bet is that they won't get past Leviticus. So we have to be honest that Leviticus is a hard book to read, and many of us may feel like giving up. But this video is all about encouraging you to persevere, because Leviticus is a book that all Christians should know something about. So why? Well, first of all, the book of Leviticus, there's lots of confusion about it, and there's not a clarity about how it was put together or when exactly. It's not a narrative book like Exodus, where we've had these lovely stories about Moses, and that story again gets picked up in Numbers and then Deuteronomy, the story of Moses and the people in the wilderness. There are lots of rules, lots of regulations, lots of talk about different things. And one focus of the book is on the priests. And that word that is used in the Bible, Levi, a word we encounter repeatedly in the Old Testament, can be seen as referring to priests, and that's where the Greek name of the book, Leviticus, comes from. And so there's a lot about priests in the book, but there's also a lot about rituals and festivals. And again, all of that can seem very alien to us, very foreign, very far away, and very irrelevant. But if we're going to understand the people of God, the Israelite people, and to understand why they were as they were in the time of Jesus, we have to understand something about those, because as modern anthropologists and sociologists will tell us, rituals and festivals tell us so much about a people. And if we think about ourselves, what do our own rituals tell us about us? What do the things that we celebrate tell us about us as a people and us as individuals? For example, they tell us what we value, what events we think are important, what times of year, and who is important. Central, though, to the book of Leviticus is a theme that permeates the whole Old Testament and the New Testament, and arguably all Christian life afterwards. And that is the question of holiness. Now, holiness and being holy has a bit of a bad rap these days, and we think of expressions like being holier than thou, and we think of holiness perhaps as being fake piety or something like that. But holiness essentially just means being separate, being distinct. And we see that emerging holiness in the books of Genesis and Exodus. We see the holiness of God, that God is somehow distinct from God's creation. And we see that call for that distinction in things like the creation of the tabernacle. And I know we've all been very excited about the dimensions of the curtains and the curtain poles, but there's that idea of separation between what is holy and what is not holy. And that theme is developed in Leviticus with this idea that God's people should reflect somehow the holiness, the distinct nature of God by being themselves holy, by being themselves somewhat separated from the rest of creation, that they are meant to reflect the holiness of God, to live to a different set of rules and standards. And Leviticus asks that question of how we can be holy like God. And it's very clear that holiness affects every aspect of life. So as we've mentioned, what people eat, what they wear, how their family works, how they work. So, for example, observing the Sabbath. And observing the Sabbath, having a day of rest, is something that made the Israelite people, the Jewish people, really distinct and separate from others in the ancient world. But really importantly is what holiness leads to. Holiness leads to practical effects. And we'll see that in Leviticus with the way that people treat slaves and servants and foreigners, and how they treat their own land, and how they treat things like debt. And there's a reason that Leviticus, parts of Leviticus have been really important for social campaigners. And particularly as Methodists, if you're watching this and you are a Methodist, this notion of holiness is really important for the teachings of John and Charles Wesley, who talked a lot about holiness. And again, that was often misunderstood as being holier than thou and looking saintly. But it was really about what the practical effect of following Jesus was. How did it make Christians distinct and separate from other people? And one of the challenges that John Wesley repeatedly gave in his sermons, and which made him very unpopular, was to ask, well, what difference does it make that you say that this book of the Bible and this person, Jesus Christ, are important in your life? How does it make you distinct and separate from other people? And that question remains to our own day. But for me, the most important aspect of why we should read Leviticus at least once in our lives is that we really cannot understand Jesus and the New Testament without it. And it's really impossible to understand why, for example, Jesus went up to the temple at certain times, why he participated in certain festivals without understanding something about Leviticus. It's impossible for us to understand why Jesus was in seemingly continual conflict with other people about how the rules of holiness should be interpreted, how the food law should be interpreted and other things, without having that grounding in Leviticus of where these rules originally came from. And especially, it is impossible for us to understand some of the language that is used about Jesus and Jesus uses about himself if we don't have understanding of things like sacrifice, and in particular that really central chapter. And if you read no other chapter in Leviticus, read this one, chapter 16, which speaks about the Day of Atonement. And that word atonement, literally at one meant, being at one with God, is so central to understanding what it is that God is doing in Jesus Christ. What is the purpose of the cross? And for Christians, spoiler alert, Jesus ends all those necessities for those rituals and those sacrifices by being the one perfect sacrifice. And that's something that we will need to discuss later because it's so central and so important for our understanding of who Jesus was and our own faith. And if I give you one final reason to read Leviticus and persevere, we remember that, as other commentators have noted, this was the Bible that Jesus knew. When Jesus talks about the scriptures and how he fulfills the scriptures, this is what he is talking about, books like Leviticus. And when at that crucial moment in his ministry, he was asked, well, what is the greatest commandment? It was in part to the book of Leviticus that he turned in Leviticus 19:18, where he quotes, "Love your neighbor as yourself, for I am the Lord." So I wish you every blessing with the book of Leviticus. Don't be afraid to skip bits. Don't be afraid to catch up or omit bits or say, well, I might come back to that another day. Do try to persevere if you can. Keep coming back to me or other people if you have questions, and let's talk about all of this later together. I hope that you can find some joy and some holiness in this book.